Quality, comfort, and grip at an affordable price. Whether it's our standard, pro, or elite socks, there's an option for everyone. Try a pair for yourself now at puregripsocks.com.
Okay, this one might not be a good idea. As of a couple days ago, we've officially crossed the 1-year mark since Adidas reintroduced the F50 as their inline speed boots. Where if history is to repeat itself, at least in the case of the Predator series and now the F50 formerly known as X, 1 year tends to be the typical life cycle until we get something new. Where inside these boxes, I have the Elite, Pro, and League tier F50s in the new Road to Glory pack colorway, which hasn't really been presented as a new F50, but it does see some subtle changes compared to all previous colorways. We're going to talk about what exactly those differences are and whether or not they make any difference at all when it comes to the fit, feel, or performance of the F50 that we've come to know and love. Starting with the top end F50 Elite, this of course being the standard laced variation that retails for exactly the same $260 as previous colorways. You can also get this Road to Glory pack color in laceless form at the same $260. The messy version is not a part of this pack. There doesn't appear to be a mid-cut women's variation in this colorway either. And as far as what I've seen so far, it doesn't look like they're making an F50 Plus in the Road to Glory pack either. Nonetheless, as far as colors and graphics go, feel free to leave your own opinions down below in the comment section, but this might just be my favorite general release F50 so far. The new graphics package I think looks way better than what they've been putting out over the last year or so. The stripes kind of remain the same. They have a little bit of a fade out towards the end. I actually like the F50 logo here on the toe, and in general, not having that kind of border graphic that's kind of an homage to the 2010 F50 Adizero, I think just makes this general silhouette, despite not being different in shape, just look a lot more sleek. And honestly, the combination of the white base with the purple and gold accents with the black logos, I just think looks fantastic. And even the sole plate with this faded out kind of F50 graphic that flows into a nice metallic gold, it just has a super premium look to me. Sitting just below the Elites is the first takedown model F50 Pro, which retails for the same $150 as it has in past colorways. And of course, $150 is a heck of a lot less expensive than the $260 for the top end Elite. So what exactly is the difference? Well, all the same upsides and downsides still apply to this subtle refresh in that the upper is more or less 1-to-1 compared to what you're going to get on that top end Elite model, in that it's a fiber touch synthetic with your micro texture sprint skin on the surface. Of course, there is no external heel counter, and that's because of instead of a sprint frame 360 sole plate, you're going to get a sprint shell 360, which isn't quite as light and does have a little bit of a different feel, even affecting the shaping of the boot slightly. But in general, you can kind of look at this as the same upper as the top end model with just an overall heavier feel. But when I say heavier, I don't necessarily mean that these boots are going to slow you down. They're just not as light as the top end model. And then below the F50 Pros, you have the second tier takedown model F50 League, which once again gets even less expensive, retailing for $90. This of course being the laced variation, which I think with these new graphics does a really good job of not looking cheap. They definitely have a very premium aesthetic to them. However, there are some pretty major differences in that you no longer get a fiber touch upper, but instead fiber skin, which is still a textile mesh-based synthetic material. And instead of sprint web, you're getting sprint grid as your micro texture on the surface. The general shaping and fit of the boot is obviously different. You don't have the external heel counter once again, and that's because this does not have a sprint frame, but instead what they are calling a sprint plate. Yet another variation of that high-end F50 design that, just like the Pros, weighs quite a bit more than what you're going to find from the top end Elites. But again, for $90, I think your expectations can only be so high, with the FG stud pattern more or less remaining the same as what you're going to get on that top end model, except for whatever reason on the Leagues, despite the stud shape and stud length being exactly the same, it's listed as FG MG on the low end variations, implying that you can use it on both firm natural grass and artificial grass playing surfaces without having to worry about voiding your warranty. How that makes any sense, given that you can see that these two stud patterns are exactly the same, I'm not entirely sure, but it is definitely one of the upsides of the League Tier F50. With the other League Tier option actually being the F50 League Laceless, which for previous colorways has retailed for an extra $10 at $100. However, and we don't see this very often these days, this new colorway or variation, if you want to call it that, has actually seen a price decrease, dropping to $90, meaning that if you really want the laceless variations, just like the Elites, you no longer have to pay a premium. So well done to Adidas for making that adjustment. All boots that, by the way, you can pick up below their normal retail prices by way of some exclusive SR4U coupon codes by checking out the links down below. But that's enough about variations and pricing. What has actually changed with these new F50s? Starting with the top end Elites, very little has actually changed. So if you have a current pair of F50s, it is very likely that if you were to run out and buy this new pair expecting them to feel like a new pair of football boots, or at least something drastically different from your current pair, you're going to be a little bit disappointed, because realistically only one thing has changed, and that change is just extremely subtle. With the main difference being the sprint web texturing on the surface of the upper that I would argue has actually gotten a little bit more aggressive with this refresh, if we can even call it that, where all of the graphics that you see here in purple and gold are where you're going to see the positioning of this sprint web micro texture. So it still borders all along the bottom of the foot, but as you can see, raises up quite significantly into the toe box and forefoot area and just covers a lot more surface area, and is now much longer lines than it used to be, that also seem to be raised up a little bit taller, where as you run your finger along the surface of the upper, they just have more roughness to them in general than previous colorways have had. Where if you look at this very recent F50 colorway drop, you can see highlighted in black is all of that sprint web micro texturing that kind of borders again the bottom of the football boot, but it's broken up and it's made up of these tiny little lines. You have very little across the middle of the forefoot, and then just a little bit very subtly placed here on the top side of the forefoot as you get to the inside and the outside of the upper. But in comparison to this new variation, again, the grip texturing is just more significant, and it doesn't necessarily make the boot feel sticky on the ball. It just adds that little bit of abrasion texture on the surface that does enhance the grip in such a way that isn't necessarily sticky, but is certainly noticeable. Where if you're going from the old pair to the new pair, some might notice a very subtle difference, but in general, like I said, this change is so minor that realistically there is absolutely no reason to rush out and buy the new ones unless you're just due for a new pair. Moving to the pros, given that they have pretty well the exact same upper as the Elites, all of the same changes apply. The only thing that I will say is the micro texturing, or I should say sprint web texturing, on the pros doesn't feel quite as rough or as raised as what you're going to find on the Elites. But again, that difference is so subtle on the ball, you really can't feel a difference. Other than that, aesthetically, you might have noticed that this version of the F50 Pro maybe comes across as being a little bit more sleek looking, and that's because in comparison to past colorways where they had this kind of mock external heel counter in the form of this fused on piece of really thin, kind of like rubbery plastic material, they have just decided to remove that entirely and stop trying to make the Pro F50 look like the top-end F50 Elite, which personally I can very much appreciate, and I think the boots look better for it. And then as for the F50 Leagues, you're still going to find the fiber skin textile-based upper with that kind of ridged micro texture across the surface of the material that they call Sprint Grid. That does add texture, but doesn't have the same roughness as what you're going to find on the higher end models. You will also notice that there isn't really a clear part through the midfoot. They just changed up the liner ever so slightly where it's just solid all the way through. I'm assuming it's just a little bit less expensive for them to manufacture this way, which is why they made that change. But at the end of the day, it really makes no difference in regards to the way that the boots fit or feel, with the only structural differences you're going to find between these and an older colorway is, once again, they have not put in that extra piece of material to make it look like the boot has a heel counter, which again, I think benefits the overall look. And then if you look along the sides of the lacing system, the textile material changes to a slightly smoother texture where the lace holes are positioned, where in comparison to the previous generation, it kind of has that ridge texturing all the way up. Why they made this very subtle change, I'm not entirely sure, but once again, it's not super important in that it really doesn't make a difference. And as for the laceless version of the F50 League, everything I just talked about applies to this football boot, but you will notice across the top of the foot for the laceless system, there's now a little bit of variation to that knitted material for the actual laceless structure itself, where if we look at previous colorways, there is no pattern. It's just completely smooth all the way through. Cosmetically, it's once again maybe a little bit more premium than it used to be, but in terms of tension, general fit and feel, and honestly just the way that the boots perform, once again, there is no discernible difference. And then just for fun, here's a look at the boots on feet, specifically the top end Elite model. No difference in shaping, no difference in fit. The upper feels identical. The sole plate is exactly the same. Width and sizing is also unchanged. So as far as this being a new F50 in any regard that a normal person is going to feel, it really isn't. It's more so just a slightly upgraded look, which personally I'm a really big fan of. I think they knocked it out of the park with this colorway, and I think the graphics as a whole just look really good. But as always, feel free to leave your opinions on that down in the comment section. From a comfort perspective, I actually think Adidas have done a really good job with the regular version of the F50. There's obviously a bunch of different varieties, but I think if you're just looking for that thin, raw, barefoot feel from a pair of speed boots that ultimately feel relatively simple, the regular version of the F50 is a fantastic option, especially if you're not really into that super sock-like feel, which I think is kind of more along the lines of what you're currently getting from the Mercurial series. And then again, if you want something slightly more padded and, dare I say, leather-like, but still synthetic, that's where the messy version of the F50 kind of comes into play. It's all a matter of personal preference. No matter what, I wouldn't really say there's a bad version of the current top-end F50. As far as sizing is concerned, I'm wearing these in my usual size 9.5 US, and the fit and the length is perfect. So if you are looking to get a pair, like Adidas speed boots have been in the past, I would strongly recommend going true to size. And certainly from a width perspective, because they are speed boots, obviously the fit is relatively snug, more so through the midfoot than anywhere else. But as long as you like that tighter overall fit, these are going to be wide enough for the vast majority of people. So there you have it, a slightly more aggressive sprint web micro texture on the Elites and the Pros, and arguably a more premium aesthetic across the board for the entire F50 line. Is it reason enough to run out and upgrade your current F50s? For the vast majority, probably not, but I suppose for the sake of improving the product without ruining that original recipe, you could argue that the new F50 is a little bit better than the old one. And I mean just a little bit, like the smallest amount. Like you need a microscope to see how much better it is. It's hardly new.